several years now. And he is going to speak on the roots and consequences of anti-Semitism. Sandy Lowe has an earned doctorate from the Graduate Theological Union. He has an honorary doctorate from the Hebrew Union College. He's an ordained rabbi and has taught at Santa Rosa Junior College. He's taught religious studies for over 30 years. He also wanted me to tell you and to let you know that he's a fellow of the Jesus Seminar. You're in for a real stimulating lecture, and I'd like you all to welcome Sandy Lowe.
Thank you. Thank you once again, Myrna. Now, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes? Good. Just out of curiosity, outside of, I won't say old-timers, forget it. Outside of the pillars and stalwarts, how many students here have been at this particular lecture before? I'm just curious about that. Okay, one. Okay. Started a question about Bible. I teach biblical studies at the Santa Rosa Junior College, and I have one course in the Old Testament, Hebrew Scriptures, and one in the New Testament. And I like doing this in my own classes, but just here, for my sake and for your sake as well, just a show of hands on how many of you have had any, how do I put it? I'm going to ask the question, how many of you have any kind of Bible reading experience? And break it up into, okay, that's quite a few. So how about Old Testament? Let me see. How many of you consider Old Testament? That's a pretty good showing. How about New Testament? Not bad. So then maybe you understand some of what I'm talking about. Usually I would expect something different. I want to first of all congratulate you for taking on the task of looking at something that has been so unpleasant and so completely dominated and perhaps even shaped the 20th century, which blessedly is over. I say blessedly because we would not want to repeat it, I don't think. In preparing to talk about some of the things that I want to share with you today, I realized that I may be saying some things that sound very, very harsh and even atrocious. If that's so, I'm not doing it because I mean to offend anyone here. I'm doing it because it's what the past sounded like. If you have never heard what I'm talking about today, in a way that's good, because maybe the past is finally dead. On the other hand, it would be very difficult to understand anything about the 20th century without understanding the clatter and the terror and the rhetoric that got us to that point. Let me give an example, slightly off subject, but not altogether. I imagine with American studies going hot and heavy in the universities today, that almost all of you have taken courses in American studies which required you to take a look at the history of slavery in the United States. Is that correct? How many have done that? Let me see. Okay. Then I'm going to make a presumption that at a certain point you were stunned by the notion, by the concept that somehow this really was a slave nation. And that somehow there really was a master class and there were a large number of slaves treated more harshly perhaps than any other slaves in any other civilization in history. And I don't know if you ever stopped along the way to consider how is it possible to have lived in those times, because those times actually aren't that far away. How would it have been possible to live during those times? What side would you have been on? Could you have been a master? How would you have taken slavery? I'm just presuming somehow that those questions have crossed your mind. Needless to say, and I'm not going to go into a great dissertation on this, the debate over slavery, almost from the very beginning, was not simply a debate on ethics, but always had religious language attached to it. This in part because the slave owners, because the folks who brought the Bible with them in English, the Anglos, read the Bible, believed that when they were establishing their society here in this country, to one extent or another, they were establishing a Christian civilization, and that everything they would be doing here would be based on Christian principles, even though, certainly before the Revolution, didn't really even know that they were going to be establishing a secular government. So it's not unusual in the days, for instance, before the Civil War. I'm just going to read one little passage to you from a politician in the South who was a virulent defender of slavery, and who, like so many others of his time, used Scripture to justify the act. But you have to agree with me or not, slavery did exist as an institution in this country and was blessed and sanctioned by churches left and right and up and down, whether you like it or not. That's just part of the history. So that's why the question I ask is, could you get yourself inside that mind frame? How would it have been possible to make such a statement, the statement that I'm going to read right now? So this fellow, who was his name? His name is James Henry, who obviously comes from a long line of bigots. He was the governor of South Carolina. That gives him great credentials right there. A United States senator, and a leading states' rights advocate and an extremist among the defenders of slavery and the critics of the abolitionists. And he writes this little passage that I'm going to share with you. I believe it's in the 1840s, years before the Civil War. And he's been trying to show that the Bible justifies slavery. And so referring to the societies of the biblical period, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, he says this: although slavery in its most revolting form was everywhere visible around them, no visionary notions of piety or philanthropy ever tempted them to gainsay the law, even to mitigate the cruel severity of the existing system. On the contrary, regarding slavery as an established as well as inevitable condition of human society, they, that is the biblical people, never hinted at such a thing as its termination on earth. That's not true, of course, but okay. Any more than, quote, that the poor may cease out of the land, which God affirms to Moses shall never be. St. Paul actually apprehended a runaway slave and sent him to his master. Instead of deriving from the gospel any sanction for the work you have mistaken, he's talking to the abolitionists, it would be difficult to imagine sentiments and conduct more strikingly in contrast than those of the apostles and those of the abolitionists. It is impossible, therefore, to suppose that slavery is contrary to the will of God. It is equally absurd to say that American slavery differs in form or principle from that of the chosen people. We accept the Bible terms as the definition of our slavery, and its precepts as the guide of our conduct. And he's boasting, by the way. I think then I may safely conclude, and I firmly believe, that American slavery is not only not a sin, but especially commanded by God through Moses and approved by Christ through his apostles. And here I might close its defense. What God ordains and Christ sanctifies should surely command the respect and toleration of man. Isn't that a kicker? It's only a little over, about 150 years ago, figure. And I think that the thinking behind it probably was kicking around even 50 years ago. And I wouldn't be surprised if there were certain little corners and pockets, especially in South Carolina, where it still hangs out. But it was real. That's the point. This is not some fantasy. And certainly I'm not here advocating for slavery, nor am I in the business of quoting Scripture to justify it. You get? Now I'm going to do a similar thing with anti-Semitism. So if you get stuck somewhere along the way, and it really hurts, think about what I just did. Because in a certain way, we're still in the midst of that struggle. We say, well, slavery formally ended a little over 100 years ago, but the Holocaust was only 50 years ago. So we're a little closer to that, and perhaps to some of the thinking involved. I hope not. So that's where I'm at. My thesis, then, is that there are religious roots to anti-Semitism. And the religious roots are in Scripture itself, especially in the literature of the New Testament. Now, if I had a lot of time, I could probably trace some antecedents of that there were outbreaks and expressions of anti-Semitism in the world even before Christianity came along. But with the rise of the Christian church and the rise of rabbinic Judaism, and I'm going to take you on a quick trip through that today, some rhetoric was let loose that got written down and subsequently became sacred scripture. It's caused a lot of problems ever since. A couple of years ago, so I think I'm just going to turn to that aspect. I'm assuming that a number of you were able to load the readings for this. There was one element that was left out. So I ask you, this was just handed out to you now? And so if you would take that out, I want to read two selections from the New Testament with you. And this is where the discussion will begin. And this is where I'm pointing the finger, to the extent that we can point the finger and say, okay, where did anti-Semitism begin, or where does it dovetail any way with Christian thinking? And again, it doesn't sound, but Christians don't think like this. Well, but some of the early Christians did. And here's where it gets expressed. The first selection that we're going to read is from Matthew chapter 27, although in the four Gospels, each of the Gospels has a story about Jesus being crucified. And each of them, to one extent or another, will say about the same thing. Some are more virulent, some less. So I want to read this with you. I was in full. And I want you, as we're reading through it, to ask yourself, according to the text that we're reading, who or what is responsible for the death of Jesus? Okay, that's a fundamental question. Now, I see a couple of you don't have this in front of you. That might be useful. Do you not have it in front of you? Do some people want copies of this?
I can pass them out.
Sure. And to anybody else who needs them?
Anybody else?
Okay. So the question again, according to Matthew, who is responsible for the death of Jesus? And it starts, when morning came, the chief priests and elders of the nation met in conference to plan the death of Jesus. Well, that kind of gives it away right there, doesn't it? So who is that? Who does it say? The chief priests and elders. Can you see it? But it goes on. Jesus was now brought before the governor, and as he stood there, the governor asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "The words are yours," said Jesus. And to the charges laid against him by the chief priests and elders, he made no reply. Then Pilate said to him, "Hear all this evidence that is brought against you?" But he still refused to answer one word, to the governor's great astonishment. At the festival season, it was the governor's custom to release one prisoner chosen by the people. There was then in custody a man of some notoriety called Jesus Barabbas. When they were assembled, Pilate said to them, Which would you like me to release to you, Jesus Barabbas or Jesus called Messiah? For he knew that it was out of mouth they had brought Jesus before him. While Pilate was sitting in court, a message came to him from his wife. Have nothing to do with that innocent man. I was much troubled on his account in my dreams last night. Meanwhile, the chief priests and elders had persuaded the crowd to ask for the release of Barabbas and to have Jesus put to death. So when the governor asked, which of the two do you wish me to release to you? They said, Barabbas. Then what am I to do with called Messiah? Asked Pilate. And with one voice they answered, crucify him. Why? What harm has he done? Pilate asked. But they shouted all the louder, crucify him. Pilate could see that nothing was being gained and a riot was starting. So he took water and washed his hands in full view of the people, saying, my hands are clean of this man's blood. See to that yourselves. And with one voice the people cried, his blood be on us and on our children. He then released Barabbas to them, and he had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. So let's take a couple of minutes. According to what this says, let's put it on a couple of levels. We'll ask the moral question and then the legal question. Morally, according to this argument, who is responsible for the death of Jesus? Well, we've already seen the chief priests and elders. Add something else, right? The crowd, the people as well, right? Is that it? Or is there anything more? All the people and take a look. And their children. So all the people and their posterity, whoever would follow. Okay. So that's clearly the moral judgment here. Now, legally, who is responsible for the death of Jesus? Is that clear? I mean, that's very clear. And if it isn't, it should be anyway. The Romans in charge had a monopoly on power and on the death penalty. And it was their right, their privilege, to put people to death. So that's what they did. Okay. They don't read this in church that much anymore. They used to. Especially, it's one of these passages that was read, especially during Holy Week, prior to Easter. It may have culminated on Good Friday itself. Generally was read on Good Friday all over Europe to commemorate the crucifixion. And in the wake of the reading of this passage from Scripture, and depending on the time and the place and the preacher, people would often leave the churches, and if there were Jews living in some quarter of their town, go over to the Jewish quarter and pillage and kill and get even for what was felt to be the death of the Lord. Now, this can only happen if people are reading this story and believing it, first of all, that it all came out of the sky, ready-made, that this is all completely the truth. And furthermore, that it all happened yesterday, and that the Jews living down the street are the same Jews who killed Jesus 1,500 years before, or 1,000 years before. In other words, people were not thinking terribly critically or making any judgments or distance between and the sacred text that they were reading. So that's where we start. We start with a text that is loaded. Okay. The next text doesn't talk about the elders and the priests and the people, but rather talks about the Pharisees. And I'll say a little bit more about them in just a bit. But suffice to say that they are, another word for Pharisees is that they are the rabbis. And these would be the teachers of the lower classes of people, which is virtually everybody. They're not priests, they're not in the power structure, but they're below. And to that extent, Jesus himself may have been a Pharisee. He may certainly have been influenced or educated as one. I used to have very strong opinions that that was the case. I've changed my mind a little bit on that. But let's read this one. This is chapter 23, also from Matthew. It's often called the diatribe against the Pharisees. And it says, this is all Jesus' word, Jesus speaking here. It says, Jesus then addressed the people and his disciples in these words. The doctors of the law and the Pharisees sit in the chair of Moses. Now, first of all, let me pause. What do you think that means, to sit in the chair of Moses? Take a guess. Yeah, okay. So that the Pharisees, he's saying, are pretty good authorities. That he sits in the chair of Moses, or that these people sit in the chair of Moses, that if you want to find out what the Bible means, or what the law of Moses means in any way, go to the Pharisees because they are the experts. When Jesus is saying this. And he says, further he adds to them, therefore do what they tell you and pay attention to their words. So there's no question but that these are the authorities, not the priests, but these scholars, these Torah literate lay scholars are the ones you should pay attention to. But, he says, do not follow their practice. For they say one thing and do another. So what's the problem? Yeah, he's charging them with being hypocrites. They make up heavy packs and but remember, in order to be a hypocrite, you have to be at least half right. Looking at the sunny side of things, right? Okay. So he's saying they're saying the right things. As a matter of fact, you should do exactly what they tell you, but just don't do what they do because they don't do it themselves. They're hypocrites. They make up heavy packs and pile them on men's shoulders, but will not linger to lift the load themselves. Whatever they do is done for show. They go about with broad phylacteries and with large tassels on their robes. They like to have places of honor at feasts and chief seats in the synagogue, to be greeted respectfully in the street, and to be addressed as rabbi. But you must not be called rabbi, for you have one rabbi, and you are all brothers. Do not call any man on earth father, for you have one Father, and he is in heaven. Nor must you be called teacher, for you have one teacher, the Messiah. The greatest among you must be yours. For whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. And here comes the diatribe. Alas, alas for you lawyers and Pharisees, hypocrites that you are. You shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in men's faces. You do not enter yourself, and when others are entering, you stop them. Alas for you lawyers and Pharisees, hypocrites, you travel over sea and land to win one convert, and when you have won him, you have made him twice as fit for hell as you are yourself. Now we're going to skip some. Down to verse 25. Alas for you lawyers and Pharisees, hypocrites, you clean the outside of the cup and dish, which you have filled inside by robbery and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee, clean the inside of the cup first, then the outside will be clean also. Very righteous condemnations of public abuse of power and corruption. Really, by the way, I love reading this stuff because I always think of some politicians while I'm doing it and feel tremendously righteous. You can do the same thing. Alas for you lawyers and Pharisees, hypocrites, you are like tombs covered with whitewash. They look well from outside, but inside they are full of dead men's bones and all kinds of filth. So it is with you. Outside you look like honest men, but inside you are brimful of hypocrisy and crime. Now this is really what Jesus went around saying. It's a wonder he lived as long as he did. Very provocative kind of thing. I dare say that if people went around saying that today, they would be in a lot of trouble about our rulers. Let's pick up with verse 33. Here's a great one. Try this at a presidential banquet sometimes. You snakes, you vipers brood, how can you escape being condemned to hell? I send you therefore prophets, sages, and teachers. Some of them you will kill and crucify, others you will flog in your synagogues and hound from city to city. And so on you will fall the guilt of all the innocent blood spilt on the innocent, Abel to Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Believe me, this generation will bear the guilt of it all. What he's saying, in effect, is Not only are you hypocrites in this generation, but you bear the guilt for all the murders that have ever been committed from the time of Cain, which is the beginning of the world, till now. Phew. I think in English class they might call it hyperbole. And then he looks around at the city, Jerusalem. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city murders the prophets and stones the messengers sent to her. How often have I longed to gather your children as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, but you would not let me. I wonder if the Pope is planning on saying that at the end of March when he visits Jerusalem. We'll see. Look, look, and he points up to the temple. There is your temple forsaken by God, and I tell you, you shall never see me until the time when you say blessings on him who comes in the name of the Lord. And then the very next chapter begins. He was leaving the temple when his disciples came and pointed to the temple buildings, and he answered and said, yes, look at it all. I tell you this, not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down. So, a prophecy is made that Jerusalem will be punished, and the punishment will come for what reason? Or reasons?
Because they scorned the prophet.
They scorn the prophet. They're hypocrites in terms of their own teachings, and they're evidently a class of corrupt and inveterate murderers. Good, lovely charges. All right, so that's kind of where it's at. It doesn't sound like sweet Jesus, does it? Like Sunday school Jesus? Sweetness and light? You know, the one who glows in the dark. That's an angry man in an oppressive time. So, but part of the history. I have a question. Why don't I take the question and then go ahead. Yeah.
Just a comment. Verse 37 of Matthew 23. And he says, oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you read it.
Yeah.
The city that murders the prophets and stones the messenger sent to her. But it comes down here, and I think Messiah is very sad. How often have I longed to gather
Yeah.
your
Okay.
children as a hen gathers her brood,
Right.
her wings, but you would not let me.
Okay. Yeah, fine. I understand what you're saying. Let me go on.
Okay.
Yeah. These are the passages I have to begin with because this is the sacred literature, and we're stuck with it. But I guess I have to put out an assumption. This is the way I approach it, and I think the way most modern scholarship approaches this material. If you have been raised in a fairly traditional church, or even if you haven't been raised in one at all, and all you have ever been exposed to is TV at Christmas time, then you probably get the traditional notion that the Bible is God's Word and that everything in it must be true and everything in it probably happened. Pat Robertson will tell you that. Jerry Falwell said that. I must pass this on again and again. I heard Falwell in a radio interview claim that, and I don't remember the exact number, but it was something he actually said, that he believed that all 5,742 words of the Bible were written by Jesus Christ himself. Which not even the Pope would say. Nobody is as foolish as to say that. But somehow behind it, there's a treatment of the Scripture that this is special literature and it comes from some other place, namely heaven. And to that I just have to say that I demur, and most modern scholars will also demur, for a good reason. People decide or decipher God's meaning or God's words in Scripture, but Scripture came out of very specific times and places in history, in ancient history. What I'm saying is that parts of them may be very true. They may be, they certainly are all mirrors and voices from the past. And our job as modern people is to read them critically, not uncritically, like this thing just falls out of the sky, but understanding that these are in effect messages from people who lived very, very long ago. So these passages did not fall out of the sky yesterday, but they were written down sometime by a fellow, we think by the name of Matthew, early in the life of the church. And give you a little bit of history on that, just a bit. So there are specific expressions of the early church written in a very specific historical setting. Our task then is to try to figure out who wrote them and where and when, and how might they be understood. Not how might they be understood by us today, but how were they meant to be understood when they were written. This is really, these passages that I read with you are the beginning of an anti-Jewish polemic. It's an argument against the Jews, rooted in the very fabric of Christian discourse. So the way the early Christians began to speak about themselves is they saw themselves as a persecuted, a rejected sect within the Judaism of the time who were turned away. And they were angry. And when they wrote this stuff, I don't think that they ever imagined it would be in English, first of all, and that I would be standing here in California reading it with you. But it was written for themselves in their own communities, also trying to understand, if we have the truth, why is it that our own people have turned us away? And so that, in part, it helps to explain this passage here, verse 34, where Jesus is accredited with saying, "I send you therefore prophets, sages, and teachers. Some of them you will kill and crucify, others you will flog in your synagogues and hound from city to city." The scholars tell us that this was probably written by people who experienced such hounding and harassment that were rejected by their people at their own time, and this is their response, a rather response. So I say, if we recognize this and learn to read critically, we can perhaps make some sense out of this whole argument. If we don't read critically, then the verses can become, as they have become, the basis of a virulent racism and a continuing anti-Semitic rhetoric and propaganda that has fueled the progression of the Western world. So, let's go on, if we can decode any of this. The question is, where do these biblical passages fit in? Let me give you a quick tour of Jewish history. Let's see if this works. According to the folks who recorded the Bible, and especially to the big opinion makers, who I would say would be the prophets themselves, this is the way they saw. Okay, I guess that's it. This is the way they saw and understood the history of the world from their perspective. And again, I'm saying, that it starts first with God, who is the creator of the world. And shortly after the creation, God establishes a covenant with Israel. The covenant demands from Israel certain ethical behavior and promises that, in effect, Israel will reap what it sows. So if it adheres to God's rules and regulations, it will prosper in the world. And if it turns away from God's rules and regulations, it will be disastrous. Now, the Hebrew prophets saw history as the arena where the covenant is played out. So here, see if I can do it. They see it like this sort of stock market chart, except that it doesn't go up all the way. It starts with creation, and things go along okay for a while, but things go sour, and so there's a flood, and the world is wiped out. Then God starts all over again. And after a short while, God establishes the patriarchal covenant, that is a covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, namely everything that you find in the book of Genesis. And that goes on for a while. Well, the children of Jacob, the tribes of Israel, wander down into Egypt and there fall into slavery and bondage. So now you're down at the bottom again. But God pays attention to them because of the covenant he has made with Abraham, remembers them. He comes and saves them and takes them out of bondage. That's the Exodus. And establishes them in the promised land where hundreds of years pass. Kings arise, and you have King Saul and King David, and King Solomon gets to build the great temple in Jerusalem. And the Ark of the Covenant, which Moses received at the Exodus, is laid to rest in the great temple in Jerusalem. That's a high point. But after Solomon dies, the kings of Israel get more and more corrupt, and time goes on, and the punishment for that corruption comes as the Babylonian exile. The destruction of the country, the sacking of the temple, and the people actually being taken off into exile. God again remembers the covenant and redeems his people and brings them back out again, and under the leadership of Ezra. And under his leadership, the temple is rebuilt. And we refer to that as the Second Temple period. And it's into that period that Jesus will also come. Now, before we get down here, just to mention, here's the Babylonians, here's the Second Temple. That's at about 400. There are other things that happen in between. We just don't have time to talk about it. But Rome shows up as the great oppressor power at around the year 63, comes into and takes over sovereignty over Palestine and over Jerusalem. And from the year 63, this is all BCE, before Jesus, for about 100 years, to about 70 afterwards, Rome is in charge. So it's during that period, figure the year 0, that Jesus is born. Jesus is crucified around the year 30, and then the temple is destroyed one generation later, in the year 40. So another way of looking at that or understanding it is that Jesus was born into one of the worst periods of Jewish history. Into Roman-occupied Palestine. There were insurrections, there was oppression, there was visible and harsh Roman military occupation. And during that time, you didn't really have to do too much to become too visible or make yourself a pain in the neck to get arrested and summarily executed by the authorities. There are a great many New Testament scholars today who doubt, I'm thinking of Dominic Crowson in particular, who I'll talk about in a little bit, who doubts that it was even a trial at all. He thinks that the Romans had the power simply to pick Jesus up and execute him. Period. There's no habeas corpus, no Bill of Rights. There's no attorney that you get to speak for you or anything else. He's a troublemaker, and they did away with him. So that's one way of looking at it. Now, another way of breaking this down and putting this into a little bit of historical context is this one. And this is just an outline of the political structure of Jerusalem during the time of Jesus. And what it indicates are classes, as one might expect. The ruling class is in the top box here, is Rome itself. I mean, there's no question about it. Rome is the superior power that dominates the region. It has military forces there, and again, has a monopoly on the death penalty. Digression. It was first me, but then when Hitler built his army, they deliberately modeled themselves after what they thought the Roman army looked like. I mean, the uniforms were a little different. But all with the banners and the eagles and all the other trappings of power were directly lifted out of Roman imperial power, in part because Hitler thought that the Third Reich, that is the Third Empire, was itself going to be a resurrection or a rebirth of the Roman Empire. So when one understands what life in Jerusalem might have been like, or life in Palestine might have been like in the first century, it was probably not too different from what, let's say, Holland or Belgium or France was like under Nazi occupation. There were military forces everywhere. There was also local police. So in Jerusalem, the law and order was kept by the high priest and his small police force. If they couldn't handle it, then the Romans send in the troops. Just like in France, where you had the French gendarmerie doing all of the daily dirty work. But if something got out of control, then the Nazis would send in their own big guns, or the SS. So it was modeled after the Roman rule. So remember, no Bill of Rights. The folks who work with them to make other parallels to Nazi Europe would be governments like the government in France and the governments. Tell me, where was Quisling from? Norway. Thank you. So that the prime minister who cooperated, he was Norwegian, cooperates with the Nazis, establishes what got to be known as the Quisling government. Quisling government is a synonym for people who were willingly working with the Nazis. In this case, the parallel is strong. Rome, first of all, appoints the king, the monarch. So the Herodians are a kind of a puppet monarchy, have some questionable bloodlines, and the masses of the Jewish people never followed, nor did they. The temple priesthood, similarly, you had to be a blood priest in order to rule at the temple. But you got approved only by Rome to do so. And you got left position as long as you could maintain law and order in Jerusalem. And as soon as it got out of control, Romans would move in. So at the time of Jesus, Caiaphas was there, and our reputation, the reputation that we have about him, is that he was an SOB. He outlasted several Roman procurators. So he was quite strong and vicious in his own right, but he was perfectly in collaboration with the Romans. Also got what could I say, an advisory assembly called the Sanhedrin. There were 70 members of that, and the high priest got to appoint all the members. So they were also collaborationists with the Romans. This essentially is the ruling class, maybe represents 1% of the total population of Israel. The other 99% are below the line. There is no middle class to speak of. And there you have, well, I didn't give out what they were, but mostly artisans, craftspeople, peasants. And at the bottom of the ladder, maybe 10 or 15% of the population. In Hebrew, they would be called the Amei Haaretz, the Am Haaretz, the people of the dust. I call them the dirt poor, who had no way of feeding themselves, of making a living, who literally begged in the streets and so forth. Day laborers, virtues, and so forth. Among those lower classes, this is the only leadership that we had. We had Pharisees, zealots, and Essenes. And I put them here, I put them all as messianic critics, which is to say the thing that made them different from the folks on top is that they had all come to believe, remember the up and down and up and down? They all had come to believe that now they were about as down as they could possibly go under Roman rule. But because of their understanding of the covenant, and that God always intervened on the side of the Jews and would always come to their help, especially when they were in dire straits, there was a firm belief on the part of a lot of people, not everyone, but a lot of people, that God would not let them down again. And this time he would send a Messiah, and then one, like King David himself, who would come and either destroy the Roman Empire or defeat it seriously, who would reestablish a throne again in Jerusalem. Some say it would be a Davidic throne. Others, we know now from the Dead Sea Scrolls, thought that the Messiah would not be a kingly figure, but would be a righteous priest who would come and cleanse the temple. That most of this messianic expectation was political resistance. It was the only way that people could imagine thinking that there was any possible hope under the Roman oppression. Namely, that God, and God alone, would have to be on their side. That they themselves could never organize to overthrow Rome, but it would be God alone who would do that. And when he did that, he would overthrow Rome, and he would establish not a kingdom of evil on the earth, that was already there, but he would establish a kingdom of God on earth. And not in the heavens, not in the clouds, but it would be a transformation, a political and social transformation of the world, and of Jerusalem, and of the priesthood, and of the monarchy, so that everything would run the way it's supposed to run, and that all the politicians would be honest. Now that's what we call, that's the Messianic age. That's what we're hoping for. A time when even politicians are honest. You get my drift here. Now, question, where do you think that the folks on the top stood on that matter? Do you think that they were Messianists? Do you think that they were looking to the coming of the kingdom of God? Or a Messiah? No, of course not. Why? Well, because they had it good. So these folks up here actually were rather strict biblicists. They did live by the Bible, but they didn't want any kind of extra commentary, like believing in messiahs. So among these groups, the Pharisees were the leaders. The Zealots believed pretty much what the Pharisees believed, except they went a little bit further, what the word says. They're the militants who believed that the world was going to come to an end, that God was going to come and certainly enter into history on the side of his people, but that it was their responsibility to kind of hurry this along and bring about the circumstance where God could enter into history. So they were really provocateurs. And I think when all is said, they probably ticked off the Romans so bad that finally it was the end of their world, and the Romans did come in and did destroy their society. There's another group called the Essenes who went out, they were the dropouts of the society, and they went out to the Dead Sea where they had a little commune, evidently, in preparation for, they lived a life of purity and so forth, we think, in preparation for the time when, again, the Messiah would come, but they thought the Messiah would be a priestly Messiah who would cleanse the temple, and they would be in line to get good jobs working in the temple. And we've got to think ahead. Well, there were other groups as well. I think there were probably hundreds of other groups, and as time goes on, I'm convinced that we will find evidence that will give us a better understanding of all of the varieties of Judaisms that existed at their time. There was no monolithic Jewish culture then as there is none today. There are different groups, different classes, different loads of different opinions. And way at the bottom, I would have to put this group of charismatics, a Greek word meaning filled with spirit. And there's actually a number of Jewish charismatics, mystics, healers, dreamers, dream interpreters. And the ones we know about from the New Testament, actually there are two. John the Baptist, who just had his own little operation out at the Jordan River baptizing people. But he was doing it, saying, you don't have to go up to the temple to offer up a sacrifice to be purified. You come to me, I'll give it to you wholesale. Can you get baptized here in this water? And they didn't like him in Jerusalem. Cut rate. And then, evidently, one of his followers, some say maybe a relative, was Jesus of Nazareth, who came down and joined John's ministry for a while, and then had his own visions and went off on his own and established his own ministry. His ministry was not a ministry of baptism, as you may recall if you know the New Testament. His was a ministry of preaching the kingdom. John the Baptist was known as a fierce ascetic, living on, what do they call it, locusts and honey. Jesus is accused of being a glutton and a drunkard. Loves to tell stories about big feasts and banquets. Loves to eat with people. Okay? So he's a completely different guy. Obviously didn't quite fit with John the Baptist. Went off on his own, and somewhere along the way got a reputation also as a healer kind of as a faith healer. May have come up to Jerusalem, may have thought of himself as some kind of critic, may even have thought of himself as a Messiah, but that seems doubtful. But caused a ruckus in the temple one day by throwing over some tables, and along with other people, by the way, who were doing the same thing. And that was enough to get him on the hit list of the Romans. He was a troublemaker. He ran out of Jerusalem and spent some time as a fugitive before they finally caught up with him and executed him, and that was the end of it. So, let's see. Is there anything else up? There were other groups. There were groups of Jews outside of Jerusalem altogether. Hellenistic interpreters, Philo the Therapeutic, and Paul himself in the New Testament, who describes himself as having been a Pharisee, but who has a kind of conversion experience, becomes a follower of Jesus, and actually I think becomes the definer of what Christianity is really about. So it's in that setting that these also, in this turbulent period, when some of these passages we just read were written. I'm suggesting that, let me say something else, that when Jerusalem is destroyed, all of this goes. The Herodians and the temple are gone. The priesthood is gone. This is an institution that had been there for 1,000 years. Gone. The Zealots leap into the flames rather than surrender. The Essenes scatter in the desert. We don't know what happens to them. The Baptist, John the Baptist, he's killed. Jesus, he's killed. These guys, they're way outside of it. They're in Egypt someplace so they don't get touched. The only ones left up here are the Pharisees, who the Talmud tells us were able to strike a deal with the Romans to leave Jerusalem, to not make any trouble, in exchange for which they got permission to establish an academy, a school at Yavna. It's a perfect rabbinic response to tragedy. Go to school. And happily they did. And when they did, evidently they must have carried with them all the sacred texts that they could possibly manage. And in these years immediately following the destruction of Jerusalem, I'm going to put this up. Here's another picture of it. They tried to salvage what they could after the destruction of the old way. And this really was the destruction of the ancient Israel. From that moment on, that old religion, the old religion of the temple cult, and the priesthood in the temple in Jerusalem is gone. Gone, gone. And what comes out of those ashes is rabbinic Judaism that continues to this day. What also comes out of the same ashes and out of the same destruction is a group of charismatics, the followers of Jesus, who somehow also, who follow really in the Pharisees' footsteps. I would put it all on Paul more than anybody else. Paul, because he carries Paul is really over here even before all this, who carries the job of organizing Christian churches out into the Roman Empire, so that when Jerusalem is destroyed, there's already Christian communities in place elsewhere. Just as when Jerusalem is destroyed, there are already Jewish communities in place elsewhere because there are synagogues throughout the Roman Empire. So I'm claiming that both Judaism and Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity come out of the same moment. They rise up out of the same historical catastrophe. They're also brothers and sisters. They're brethren and they're both victimized by Rome. But they have a completely different take on what just happened. The rabbis, the destruction of Jerusalem, said, God, we must have done something wrong. Well, okay, now what we'll do is we'll get it all together again, and now we'll really observe the Sabbath, and we'll really stick to the laws. And the Christians took a look at it and said, boy, you guys are so dumb. Don't you understand that the reason it happened wasn't because you were or were not observing the Sabbath. It's because the Christ was here among you. The Messiah came. You didn't recognize who he was. Matter of fact, you rejected him and you killed him. And that's why Jerusalem was destroyed. Which one was right? Neither. Jerusalem was destroyed because Rome was powerful and it had the power to do it and determined that it was in its strategic interest to do so. But neither the Jews nor the Christians could blame Rome because they were both being persecuted at that moment. Do you know that in the wake of the destruction of Jerusalem, Jewish slaves were off to Rome, and there they were put to work building the Colosseum. So that great tourist site in Rome was built by Jewish slaves. So we always hear that the Romans threw Christians to the lions in the Colosseum. But it was built by Jewish slaves. So they both were victimized, and they both came out of the same oppression, and neither of them had the strength or the imagination, but I think it was really the strength, to form the argument, say, Rome, you did it. As a matter of fact, when they write this story, the story of Jesus' crucifixion, what do they have Pilate, the Roman governor, doing? He's washing his hands, as if Rome has nothing to do with this thing at all. So what we've got in these biblical stories is, it's a piece of writing. It's out of the diary of the early church, written by people who were feeling very rejected by the Jewish, and expressing their anger in these passages that we read. Little did they have any idea, they had no idea at all, little could they have known that this literature would have become not only sacred literature, but the literature of then the Holy Roman Empire, and that the rhetoric of anti-Jewish hostility would become the official language of a triumphal Christian church, and would go on for thousands of years and produce a kind of cultural racism. There's no way that they could have foreseen that. I'm going to let's see how we're doing on time. I'm going to call your attention to the handout that you got, or to the electronic stuff that you got. Where is that? This rhetoric we're talking about here becomes, let me use this board for a minute. Scholars, when they talk about this rhetoric that we're looking at in the New Testament, refer to it initially as anti-Judaism. Because that's what it is. It's a rhetoric that puts all the blame pretty much on the Jews. Right? But after the period of its writing, and as it kicks into an ever-growing and spreading church, the rhetoric continues on, and over long periods of time will develop into a kind of racial theory. So just to distinguish it, this is a kind of a political rhetoric to begin with, becomes later an anti-Semitism. Racial meaning that somehow it is within their bones, it's within the not only the culture, but within the very body of the Jewish people themselves to be so treacherous. There are plenty of other biblical passages that I have, but on page 2, I have what emerges in the Middle Ages, actually the early Middle Ages and throughout the Middle Ages. Rosemary Radford Ruther, who's a Catholic scholar, wrote a very fine book a number of years ago called Faith and Fratricide, and it's subtitled The Theological Roots of Anti-Semitism. And there she says that it's built into the Christian claim itself, namely that the Jews rejected Jesus, and therefore God rejected the Jews as being the chosen people any longer, and instead elected the Christians to be the new chosen people, the new Israel, the new church. She did this anti-Jewish argument as the left hand of Christology, with all due apologies to Southpaws. You see how easy it is to become biased. But she refers to the left hand of Christology, meaning the right hand of Christology. Christology means the good news is that the Christ has come and salvation is open to everybody who belongs to the church. And the bad news is that God has rejected Israel, who was the old people, the old chosen people. The new chosen people is the Christian church. The old chosen people are the Jews, now rejected and cursed of God. The language also gets known as supersessionism, namely that Christianity supersedes Judaism, is a superior expression of it. Judaism in all of its expressions and creativity is always inferior to Christianity. And the argument develops through the Middle Ages under this title I put here as Adversus Judaeos, the argument against the Jews. And it goes throughout all of Christian history. We'll take a few examples. You can read more of it on your own. This one from Hippolytus in the year 220. He asks, why was the temple made desolate? Interesting, because he's talking about the temple as if it happened yesterday. Yet the destruction was before. Why was the temple made desolate? Was it on account of the ancient fabrication of the calf? Or was it on account of the idolatry of the people? Was it for the blood of the prophets? Was it for the adultery and fornication of Israel? By no means. For in all these transgressions they always found pardon open to them. But it was because they killed the son of their benefactor. For he is co-eternal with the Father. Wow. The charge then becomes the real crime. Deicide. When you killed Jesus, you killed God. That's heavy. Okay. And how do you repent for that? How do you get forgiven for that? No way. The next one, this one by John Chrysostom, who I'm always baffled because scholars often think that he is among the most articulate and important of the early church fathers and thinkers. And he's a virulent anti-Semite. He says in the year 390, if someone had killed your son, could you stand the sight of him or the sound of his greeting? Wouldn't you try to get away from him as if he were an evil demon, as if he were the devil himself? Well, the Jews killed the son of your man. Will you so dishonor him as to respect and cultivate his murderers, the men who crucified him? Get the virulence of, why is he so angry? This thing, if it did happen at all, which I don't think it did, but if it did happen, it was 400 years before, why is he getting, you know why? You know what the crime was? He lived in Antioch or in Syria. Well, a lot of Jews there, a lot of Christians there. Guess what? They were friendly. They got along. He's the bishop, and he says, you should recognize that these are the people who killed the Lord. My suspicion is that he had some other items on his agenda too, but that's what's going on. We won't read all of them, but let's skip to the last one here, also by Chrysostom, on the next page, page 3. When animals have been fattened by having all they want to eat, they get stubborn and hard to manage. Another prophet intimates the same thing when he said, Israel ran about madly like a heifer stung by a gadfly. And still another calls for an untrained calf. When animals are unfit for work, they ate marked for slaughter. And this is the very thing which the Jews have experienced. By making themselves unfit for work, they have become ready for slaughter. This is why Christ said, ask for my enemies, who did not want me to reign over them, bring them here and slay them before me. Now, I don't exactly know where Christ said that, but if Christ said it, he must be telling the truth. Why would a bishop lie? Okay? So that's virulent rhetoric, and it's not an accident. It saturates all of Christian rhetoric throughout the Middle Ages. And if you've not heard it and you haven't heard about it, good. Maybe it's dead. But the other reason you might not have heard about it is because people don't like to talk about it, including the church itself. Doesn't like to talk about its own history of racism. I mean, nobody does. We don't like to talk about our racism in America. So the church doesn't like to do it either. Ultimately, all kinds of rules, regulations, pogroms, oppressions, attacks upon the Jewish people occur throughout the Middle Ages. Through the 12th and 16th century, there's a background of crusades, then the Reformation. Jews were subject to attacks, persecutions, disputations, expulsions, expropriations, book burnings, conversions, and slaughters, routinely. The Jewish population, not large population, but the Jews were kicked out of England, all their property confiscated, and they were kicked out of England in the year 1291, out of France in the year 1391, and out of Spain and Portugal in 1492, Great Inquisition, the beginning of the Great Inquisition. All their properties confiscated, and always justified with these, with biblical verses and with this rhetoric, always. What you have on page 4 is rather devastating, compiled by Raoul Hilberg. He notes on one side, you get these two columns on one side, compared with laws that were adopted by the Nazis, in most cases after 1933. So just looking down, and the reason that this is so important, because the laws themselves seem so abominable. How could anybody do something like that? So it's like saying, well, how could we have had slavery in this country? How could anyone have justified it by reading the Bible? Did people really believe that? Yes, they did. So, for instance, the prohibition of intermarriage and of sexual intercourse between Christians and Jews was put into law as the Law for the Protection of German Blood and Honor, September 1930. Jews and Christians not permitted to eat together, adopted at the synod in 306. Jews were barred from dining cars, 1939. Jews not allowed to hold public office, 535. And the Nazis, the law for the reestablishment of professional civil service, that barred Jews from civil service, and so on. And on. Okay. Now, the reason I think this is so important, you could read it in more detail for yourself. And maybe in our question and answer period, people will either ratify what I say or have some amendments to it. I think that many of the Jews in Germany, certainly, who lived there and who stayed, thought, oh, this is bad. I mean, everybody knew it was bad. Most, I think, believed or wanted to believe that it would pass, it would get better. But also, everyone knew that this had all happened, this is nothing new that was happening in Germany. Hitler was just pulling together stuff that had happened throughout history. Everybody knew that. So the question that you had to decide for yourself, if you were Jewish at that point, or if you were married, or if you were dating a Jew, or if you had Jewish friends, was, well, will this last long? Is there anything I can do to stop it? Or is it just things are a little crazy for a while? I think the anti-Semitism is not only there, but I think it's somewhat internalized as well, which is to say, I think that Jews had almost become used to it. Oh, well, we can wait this one out. I think not unlike what had happened, especially, well, you could say anywhere in either in Africa or in the African diaspora. You don't have to be in the United States, but in Africa, under the colonialists, Africans were brainwashed to the extent that any Europeans got a hold of them and taught that they were absolutely inferior beings. And to the extent that the Africans internalized those beliefs, came to believe that about themselves, they became weak, inferior. So the great act of revolution, I'm thinking of Stephen Biko, was an act of consciousness raising to educate people, let people know this is not the way you were born. We're all born as very intelligent, very bright, very strong human beings. But these feelings of inferiority we have is the internalized oppression of imperialism, the internalization of racism. So that may have had a good deal to do with it too. Many Jews got out, many did not. I'll be brief about the rest of it. One more thing that needs to go in. This is not all Roman Catholic. We have to be equal opportunity blame today. Okay? Which is one last thing that I would like to read with you. Did I give it to you? No, I don't think so. No. Is a passage from Martin Luther, the founder of the Protestant Reformation. In 1523, shortly after the Reformation began, Luther, very high on the possibilities of the Reformation, wrote an essay in defense of the Jews, noting that Jesus himself was Jewish, and praising the Jews for not converting and becoming Christian. Because the only up until that point had been the Roman Catholic Church, and since the Roman Catholics were antichrists, he said, the Jews really knew something. But then he reasoned, but now that the true Christians have arrived, namely the Reformers, there's no reason in the world why the Jews won't, if we treat them well, won't come to their senses, realize the errors of their ways, and come into the bosom of Christ. Well, it didn't happen. And 20 years later, in 1543, shortly about 3 years before he died, I had a professor at the GTU in Berkeley who taught in the Lutheran school. He always used to say, Luther died 3 years too late. Was so irate because he heard that not only were the Jews not converting and becoming Lutheran, but they actually were successful in converting a few people and making them into Jews. He says, that's just going too far. And so he puts forth this, and this is a little essay called The Jews and Their Lies. And he writes, "What then shall we Christians do with this damned, rejected race of Jews? Since they live among us and we know about their lying and blasphemy and cursing, we cannot tolerate them if we do not wish to share in their lies, curses, and blasphemy. In this way, we cannot quench the inextinguishable fire of divine rage, as the prophets say, nor convert the Jews. We must prayerfully, reverentially practice a merciful severity. Perhaps we may save a few from the fire and the flames of hell. We must not seek vengeance. They are surely being punished 1,000 times more than we might wish them. Let me give my honest advice. First, their synagogues or churches should be set on fire, and whatever does not burn up should be covered or spread over with dirt, so that no one may ever be able to see a cinder or stone of it. This ought to be done for the honor of God and of Christianity, in order that God may see that we are Christians, and that we have not wittingly tolerated or approved of such public lying, cursing, and blaspheming of his Son and his Christians. Secondly, their homes should likewise be broken down and destroyed, for they perpetrate the same things there they do in their synagogues. For this reason, they ought to be put under one roof or in a stable like gypsies, in order that they may realize that they are not men in our land, as they boast, but miserable captives, as they complain of us incessantly before God with bitter wailing. Thirdly, they should be deprived of their prayer books and Talmuds, in which such idolatry, lies, cursing, and blasphemy are taught. Fourthly, their rabbis must be forbidden under threat of death to teach anymore. Fifthly, passport and traveling privileges should be absolutely forbidden to the Jews. Sixthly, they are stopped from usury, and engaging in commerce, and especially the charging of interest. Usury, All their cash and valuables of silver and gold ought to be taken from them and put aside for safekeeping, probably in a bank in Switzerland, if that can be arranged. Now, and he goes on. If, however, we are afraid that they might harm us personally or our wives, children, servants, cattle, when they serve or work for us, then let us apply the same cleverness as other nations, such as France, Spain, and Bohemia, as he was advocating expulsion, and settle with them for that which they have extorted usuriously from us. And after having divided it up, so seize all their goods, cash it in, divvy it up, divide up fairly, let us drive them out of the country for all time. Judenrein, to make you free of Jews. For as has been said, God's rage is so great against them that they only become worse and worse through mild mercy, and not much better through severe mercy. Therefore, away with them. To sum up, dear princes and nobles who have Jews in your domains, if this advice of mine does not suit you, then find a better one, so that you and we may all be free of this insufferable, devilish burden, the Jews. Okay, that's enough. No, it's not. After the war, almost immediately after the war, in Germany, there was a synod, a meeting of, how am I doing? Okay. There was a synod of Lutheran bishops who met. All of them, by the way, during the war, wore the swastika, pledged allegiance to Hitler, were loyal, came together, realized the disaster of the Holocaust, and issued a statement saying that it was most regrettable, but after all, the Jews had it coming. Okay. So they don't say that anymore. I think they've learned it. But what I'm suggesting is that it took the Holocaust to kick everyone in the head. And that some things have changed. And since maybe I should have spent more time on the theme, which is not just the roots of anti-Semitism, but its consequences and what happens now, where are we, is that things did change and have changed, slowly, to be sure. The Lutherans no longer say that. There are Lutherans in this country who have passed resolutions denouncing Luther for this last statement that I just read. Dissociating themselves from it. By the way, it can always be done with a policy from the past that we abhor. We must acknowledge slavery in our country and denounce it. Okay? Do both. I also gave you, as part of your printout, a series of rather remarkable activities done by the Roman Catholic Church, starting in 1965 at the Second Vatican Council. And you'll find it on this chart. In its first writing, there was a chapter on reconciliation with the Jews. It actually begins to suggest some ways out of this. It says, the Church decries hatreds, persecutions, and manifestations of anti-Semitism directed against Jews at time by anyone. Also, next column over, condemn as opposed to the very spirit of Christianity all forms of anti-Semitism and discrimination. I like this one down here. References hostile or less, this is in 1985, references hostile or less than favorable to the Jews have their historic context in conflicts between the early church, the nascent church, and the Jews. Certain controversies reflect Christian-Jewish relations long after the time of Jesus. It shows that if they want to, even the Catholic Church can read these texts critically, put them into a perspective, teach them this way. No, these words that fall down, that are in Scripture, are not words that fall from the sky. They can be denounced. They must be denounced. One last thing. There's plenty more that I could do, but one last thing. A book written by one of the founders of the Jesus Seminar published a few years ago called Who Killed Jesus? And it's subtitled Exposing the Roots of Anti-Semitism in the Gospel Story of the Death of Jesus. A whole book just on that. Written by Dominic Crowson, who himself was a Catholic priest. He dropped out of the priesthood, but he still teaches at a Catholic institution in this country. He's one of the leading New Testament scholars in the country. Writes this, and you should be able to understand what he says. That reiterated juxtaposition of Jewish demands for Jesus' crucifixion and Roman declarations of Jesus' innocence is not prophecy, and neither is it history. It is Christian propaganda. Let me be very clear about what I'm saying. For Christians, the New Testament texts and the gospel accounts are inspired by God, if you want to believe that. But divine inspiration necessarily comes through a human heart and a mortal mind, through personal prejudice and communal interpretation, through fear, dislike, and hate, as well as through faith, hope, and charity. It can also come as inspired propaganda, and inspiration make it any the less propaganda. In its origins, the first moments that Christian propaganda was fairly innocent, those first Christians were relatively powerless Jews, and compared to them, the Jewish authorities represented serious and threatening power. As long as Christians were the marginalized and disenfranchised ones, such passion fiction about Jewish responsibility and Roman innocence did nobody much harm. But once the Roman Empire became Christian, that fiction turned lethal. In the light of later Christian anti-Judaism and eventually of genocidal anti-Semitism, it is no longer possible, in retrospect, to think of that passion fiction as relatively benign propaganda. However explicable its origins, defensible its invectives, and understandable its motives among Christians fighting for survival, its repetition has now become the longest lie. And for our own integrity, we Christians must at last name it as such. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy. We'll entertain some questions. It should have been given to you in your section to go to the course. And then we'll give you the link on the schedule. Highlight Sandy Lowe.
I was looking at the notes that you had from the first lecture on the internet. I compared some of what Jesus was saying to some of the Old Testament prophets. See, his tone wasn't that much different from their tone and some of the things that they said about some of the same people. Why was Jesus singled out as being the source of that? I think that's some kind of
Well, that's a really good question, because
Repeat the question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
The statement was, and the question was, that in comparing Jesus' words to some of the words in the Old Testament, the tone is quite similar.
And why were Jesus' words singled out in Sandy's talk?
It's a good perception. And many people still think of Jesus as a prophet. I don't, for different reasons. I mean, I think he was a teacher of wisdom and an extraordinary person. But maybe riding the coattails of the prophets. But almost all the prophets, you're right, Hebrew prophets of the Old Testament, were social critics and often condemned the people of their own time, language as virulent as what you might find in Jesus, and more so. But they remained within Jewish history. This was self-criticism. It was not a critique used against them in that way. It was a self-criticism, and the Jewish authorities later on chose to include that criticism as part of their own history. That's something that Christianity hasn't done yet. Namely, to be able to criticize themselves and include them as part of their own religious teaching. That's what the Hebrew Bible is. Jesus, I would say, is I've heard this term and it really makes a lot of sense to me, is a boundary figure. He was born a Jew and he died a Jew. He was not a Christian. He didn't know that there would be a church coming up along after him, or that he would be triumphant in the Roman Empire. It would have been obnoxious to him, since he hung out with all the people at the bottom of the ladder and never the people at the top. So the term I've heard is that Jesus was a boundary figure. That is to say, he was completely Jewish in his own age, but as soon as he died, he becomes a mythological figure in the Hellenistic world. He's the risen Christ. He's God incarnate. He's all these other things that allow him to become a god for Europe and a god for the rest of the world. But in his own time, didn't resemble anything like that among his own people. Does that make some sense? So he's... No way. No, so it says, no, Jesus never separated himself from his own people. As a matter of fact, he wallowed in them. Yeah. Well, I'm glad I answered all your questions.
No, I
No, go ahead.
like
No, that's all
the
right.
students' questions first.
Yes, by all means.
Your overhead chart of the Gospels appearing between 40 and 70 years following the death of Jesus.
Yes.
Were the writers of the Gospels, as far as the direct observer of Jesus, should they hear those direct quotes that appear in the writings?
No.
Did everybody hear the question?
And and all of modern scholarship is based on that supposition. Also, there's really no claim made by any of the Gospels themselves that they were eyewitnesses to Jesus. Believe me, if they had been, they would have told you. So it's not there. On the other hand, we have all kinds of evidence, very clear evidence, that the Gospels are like so much else that is oral tradition that slowly gets written down, and then one copies from another, and so forth. So what it is, it's not eyewitness to Jesus, but it is ear witness or eyewitness to the first two generations, the early church. It's a good summary of what they were thinking.